Hi class, today we're going to look at adding and subtracting mixed numbers. We are in Chapter 4, Lesson 5. To add or subtract mixed numbers, you have to have the least common denominator, also known as the LCD. There are two integer rules you must follow. The first one is when the signs are the same, you keep the sign and you add. In step number 2, when the signs are different, you keep the sign of the larger value and subtract. This only occurs if you have to deal with integers. Here are some steps to follow as you solve mixed numbers. Step number 1, make sure that the fractions have a common denominator. So in other words, they have to have the same number on the bottom part of the fraction. Step 2, convert to improper fractions. We can convert them to improper fractions, or we also discussed in class today, you may use borrowing method. Now, you can only use borrowing method when it is subtraction. So make sure that you understand borrowing only occurs when you have subtracting of fractions. So only when you're subtracting. In step number 3, you either add or subtract the numerators, and you always keep the denominator the same. Step number 4, simplify or reduce, and then convert back to a mixed number if necessary. In example number 1, we want to find how we can solve 7 and 4/9 plus 10 and 2/9. So we must make sure that we have, first, a common denominator. So in step number 1, we are checking for the LCD. Now in this case, the fractions are the same. So 7 and 4/9 plus 10 and 2/9 have the same denominator. So we don't have to change anything. We can go into step 2. In step 2, we are going to add the whole numbers. And the reason why we can add the whole numbers is because they already have a common denominator with the fraction. So we're just going to add 7 plus 10, and my whole numbers together are 17. Then in step 3, you are going to add the fractions. And the reason why we can add the fractions, again, is because we have a common denominator. So I'm going to take 4/9 and I'm going to add it to 2/9. We keep the denominator is 9, and we add 4 plus 2. 4 plus 2 is 6. So now we have a fraction of 6/9. But we need to reduce the fraction. So we're going to divide top and bottom by the number 3. So we're going to divide 6 divided by 3 and 9 divided by 3. And we end up with 2/3. So that is our new fraction. The last step is that we're going to put our whole number and our fraction back together. So this is the evaluation, or the solving part. So our final answer is going to end up being 17 and 2/3. So we take our answer from step 2 and our answer from step 3, and we put them back together. And that is our final answer. Turn your notes over to the back side now. For example number 2, we have 8 and 5/6 minus 2 and 1/3, and we need to write it in simplest form. But the first step, again, is to always find the least common denominator. Now in this case, the 8 and 5/6 have two different denominators, the 6 and then the 2 and 1/3. So we have to make sure that we do get a common denominator between the 6 and the 3. So in this case, I'm going to multiply the 1/3 by 2 top and bottom, and I end up with 8 and 5/6 minus 2 and 2/6. So now I have my common denominator of 6. In step number 2, I'm going to subtract the whole numbers because now I have a common denominator. So I'm going to take 8 minus 2, and I have 6. In step number 3, this is where I'm going to subtract the fractions. And then again, it's because I have a common denominator, so I can subtract them. So now I have 5 over 6 minus 2 over 6, which equals 3 over 6. But then I notice I can reduce by 3 top and bottom, and I end up with the answer of 1/2. Now in step number 4, this is where I have my final answer. I evaluate, and I put my whole number and my fraction back together, so my answer is 6 1/2. Now for our final example, we have 2 1/3 minus 1 2/3. So in this case, we do have an LCD of 3. So the common denominator is 3, and we can keep it that way. We don't have to change anything since they are the same denominator. But I notice that this time I cannot subtract the two fractions from each other because I have the number 1 in the numerator and the number 2 in the numerator. And 1 is a smaller number than the number 2. So we're going to use the borrowing method. So now in this case, I'm going to take the 2 1/3, and I'm going to borrow from that number 2, and it leaves me a 1. I take whatever's in the denominator and I add it to the numerator. And once I do that, I have a brand new fraction of 1 4/3. Now the only fraction that stays the same is the minus 1 2/3. So I'm going to keep that the same. Now that I have a common denominator and I can subtract, I'm able to subtract my two whole numbers, 1 minus 1, which is 0, but now I can subtract my two fractions. So subtract the fractions in step 3. And I have 4 over 3 minus 2 over 3, which is 2 over 3. And then my final answer, when I evaluate, is 2/3. And the reason why it's 2/3 is because there is no more whole number, because 1 minus 1 was 0, so I have no more whole number, just the fraction part. Now go ahead and take a few minutes to complete your Got It problems. I would like to remind you that we did do your Got It problems in class already. If you go to page 300 and page 301. Make sure you double check your answers.